Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. This is the third in a series of lessons following the progression of a still life painting from a photo. If you watch the last two lessons, you'll know that we've kind of got up to this stage where we initially put a wash drawing in and then basically just kind of wash blocked or kind of dead coloured with quite washy colours the rest of the painting. So we've sort of established our primary value scheme. And we've also got our general shapes. So the idea behind getting all these things blocked in quite quickly and reasonably accurately is that we can then move into this third stage of the piece, which is basically rendering. So we kind of know the parameters of what values we're going to be using. The shapes roughly aren't going to change too much. But we can go back and refine. We can add more form. We can add more specific interesting shapes. We can start developing textures and that sort of thing. So it's gonna be a little bit shorter than the last two. I'm just gonna be focusing on mostly this little fragment of face, which is sort of made out of plaster. So looking at how I'm gonna build form with that, adding a little bit more detail to the twigs, and then possibly doing a little bit on the skull as well, but we'll see how far we get. But basically what I do with this section is just transferable to the rest of the piece. So I'll do this and then probably either with a time lapse or we'll just skip ahead to the next stage, the final stage, which will be kind of polishing everything off completely. So we're not necessarily going for a complete finish today, but you know, if things develop quite quickly and you're fairly happy with them, you won't need to go back and revisit them. So you'll have an opportunity to correct anything that doesn't quite work out in subsequent stages. But for now, we're going to aim to be as accurate as possible and get what we want as a finish immediately. So I'm going to begin, as I say, I'm going to work on this little fragment and then some of the nest or kind of twigs around it. And I'm going to begin in the shadows. So I'm going to start, it's kind of sort of roughly blocked in at the moment. I'm going to even out some of those shadows, add some more specific, or kind of make the shape at the edge more specific, and then start building halftones out into the lights. So yeah, I'm going to get started with that. First thing I'm going to do, I've got a mixture of kind of one-to-one mixture of oil to linseed oil to mineral spirits, and I'm just going to kind of lightly pick up a little bit with this dry brush or kind of clean brush and just rub it over. You'll see it starts to saturate the oil a bit. When oil dries, to a greater or lesser degree, it does this thing called sinking. Well, it has different names, but I refer to it as sinking in, where the colours become duller because the kind of sheen of the surface is lost. So when you ultimately varnish an oil painting, what you're doing is creating this kind of glassy surface, so that when the light hits the surface, it reflects directly off, and you get this kind of rich pigment. Whereas if you don't varnish it or if you don't oil in when you're painting, you get this duller version. Now the problem with painting it without oiling it in to correct the values is that you might make some decisions based on an incorrect perception of that value once it's actually varnished. So if you had a black patch and it went grey and you tried to match it with a grey colour, when you varnish it, the black will become pure black again and the little patch that you left will remain grey, so you'll end up with kind of a black and grey patchiness. It's only really a problem in the darks, it's not something you notice in the lights. So I'm just going through any of these darker portions that we might be working on and just checking. You see if I go over these lights, they don't really change as much as the darks did to the left. So that should roughly do it. Now my palette is still black, white, raw umber, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna I'm using. So it's a fairly neutral palette because most of the colours in this painting are pretty neutral. So I'm going to begin just by adding in a more even shadow tone. The shadow's all fairly uniform, there are some subtle shifts, but I'm just going to begin by kind of lightly painting in a shadow. There's certain progressions, so I can see that the shadow starts to become a bit lighter as it goes a little bit higher, possibly a little bit warmer as well. So I've mixed a little bit more white and yellow ochre into this top section. The same is true of the shadow that occurs. Just here. So what I'm basically looking for is any variations that occur in the shadows. So there's this sort of cheekbone bit that's lighter in the darkest portions. I'm also slightly correcting some of the shapes. And I'm also going to reinforce any darker edges that require a little bit more work, so working on the bed bug line, as I'm sure you've heard me talk about before. So you probably notice I'm happy to create pretty subtle shifts at this point. Earlier on I would have talked about how you want to kind of keep things simple, but this is the point where you can start to make things more complicated. Just because this is sort of aiming for the final finish. So I think that's getting pretty close to a finish for the shadows. So I'm going to start gradually working out into the halftones. I can do all this kind of with relative ease and confidence just because everything was pretty well established in the earlier stages. So I don't have to kind of worry too much about specific shapes. I can be pretty confident that everything already kind of worked. And just enjoy rendering. Obviously, if you notice any mistakes, you should correct them. Don't just leave them. But so long as you've done a reasonably good job earlier, you'll find this kind of comes together pretty smoothly. So I'm just going to kind of jump back into shadows. You'll kind of be doing a little bit of toing and froing, but you don't want to lose the overall shape of that difference between a halftone and a shadow. So make sure things don't get... One thing that may happen kind of early on when you're first starting to paint is you may start to kind of muddy things a bit and make it unclear what's a halftone, what's a shadow. So in your mind, always try to keep focused on what something is. So here I'm kind of still working on the edge of the shadow with this halftone value, which is very close to the shadow, but it's not quite the same as the shadow value. So now just going to quickly block in a slightly darker, lightest value with quite thin paint. And then work back into it with white. now I've got a much lighter colour. I'm just going to block over the top. So you can see I'm just kind of working backwards and forwards, kind of pushing and pulling with these subtle adjustments, and slowly giving some more specific forms shape. So the most important thing is that you're always really focused on the particular form you're working on at that moment, what that form is describing, and whether or not how you're painting it is effectively or describing in the way that you want it to effectively. If you can keep pretty focused on that sort of thing, you'll find everything comes together with relative ease. You want to avoid getting kind of caught up too much and starting to move away too quickly or sort of in too exaggerated way away from what you had from the initial stages of the piece. You want to stick within those parameters. And only alter anything if you kind of become aware of something being wrong. So I'm going to pretty much leave it there for this one. well, for this portion of it. I'm going to move into the little twigs next to it a bit. I'm just fiddling at the moment with this piece, with this part of it. Something like this mouth I could keep working on for, or probably will work on for quite a long time, just to get exactly the right expression. That's expression is something more of a subtle shift. It's not really a shape, quite a shape-based issue, because I'm happy with the structure of the mouth, but not quite happy with the particular expression just yet. But as I work kind of in and out, kind of slowly develop the shapes, I'll get closer to an expression I'm happy with. For the time being, I think I'm going to leave it pretty much. I say that, I'm just about to make another slight adjustment. I'm pretty much going to leave it at that for this little portion. So you'll see there's been quite a lot of development of form. And the next thing I'm going to do, or the last thing I'm going to do in this demonstration, this portion of the demonstration, is just work around it. So, lost my light. Lost it again. Get it back. There we go. So, pretty much got that rendered in. I'm going to start working around it. And initially I'm just going to work picking the right colours. I'm just going to make the particular shape, and get the particular shape of the edge of the face just right. Because at the moment it's a little bit blurry, which we don't necessarily want. And you'll find once you do that quite quickly, the form begins to pop even more in an illusionistic sense. So you can start to work up and out into these other forms as you're doing that, but my first concern is just to work on this outside boundary. But you can see I'm still paying attention to the forms that it's overlapping. So you can hopefully see that with even pretty minor development of form, quite subtle adjustments from what existed initially, suddenly a fairly sophisticated kind of three-dimensional illusion is starting to emerge. You basically just repeat this process with each particular form and texture throughout the image. Obviously it's harder than it sounds, but that's just the basic idea behind it. So now that I've kind of defined that to the extent that I want to, I've got a little bit left here actually, I can go back and start kind of working on the branches. So I might, let's say I was to pick this one, I might kind of work underneath it. We know that the light is hitting from above, so below the branch is very, try to clean my brush enough, can pretty much work pure black under it, diluted a bit, so it's easier to work with. So I can start to get a little bit more specific than the last session. Start to kind of add little patches where I see them of texture. I notice there's a kind of like dark hollows or something like that, I can add them in. Or if I want to kind of start suggesting thinner twigs, you could do that by kind of working back into the light. Don't necessarily have to draw the thinner stuff over the top. I'm not actually going to work on the skull itself today, but I will, as I'm working on these branches, I will start to describe a bit more specifically and kind of neaten up that edge of the shape. So after adding a little bit of lighter colour, I could go mix a kind of an orangey colour for the exposed portions of the wood. Kind of a mixture of burnt umber, yellow ochre and burnt sienna. Start kind of laying them. That initial colour was a little bit too dark. So start laying that over the top of the wood. It's basically like the wood's been stripped, so there's a little exposed sections. All the way along it. Once that's roughly added, I might go back. Start to add a little more kind of rounding to the forms. So this kind of bottom portion of the twig is darker than the top. The light's kind of hitting from above. And where the twig's been stripped back, I could add a little bit of relief. You can kind of see the light has hit in a particular way. All these things just start to reinforce what's going on with the form. So all the time I'm thinking about form, the context of colour and value. So I know that where the bark hasn't been stripped away, it's kind of more silvery. So I might start to work a slightly lighter colour into the portions of the twig that are angling up towards the light source, but that haven't been exposed. Certain portions of it are kind of in shadow due to the little bit of face blocking the light away from them. Something along those lines starts to, you kind of start to see the shape or the form really emerge more effectively. And if you get tired of that, you can go back to what we were doing just before, which is working on the little patches of twig behind. So in this part of the process, I'm kind of toing and froing a lot, so that you don't kind of get too stuck in a rut with your work. You're kind of trying to keep your eye fresh as you go. So after adding some of those darks, I could maybe mix up kind of brighter colour. There are these little very fine little kind of bits of straw. Kind of overlapping, kind of underneath and on top of the twigs. So I can start to add them. They'll take like quite a bit of layering because you don't want them to blend too much with each other, so it's something that kind of you would work over several days. Let it dry, kind of work more over the top, work back into it. Yeah, hopefully you get the idea. That's pretty much it for this third session. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a lot more kind of instinctive at this point, not quite so process oriented, so it's kind of reducing the previous processes down to a much smaller scale and sort of going for a finish that you want. So you can be quite painterly with it. Anything that's sort of, if you can describe something with quite a large brushstroke or a lot of kind of large empty-ish section of colour, it works well, it's more effective. You can kind of play around with textures that already exist and kind of build over the top. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So this process I would just kind of keep working across the image. So you know, in the skull I would then do the same thing, start to find those specific smaller forms, start turning them, make sure it stays within the overall context of the image. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the process. I'm going to hopefully try and do a time lapse, which I might post as a separate video of different portions of the piece, maybe put together. And then once everything's kind of roughed into this stage, I'll come back and kind of talk about how you might polish it, how you could do subtle glazes or add a little bit more detail, that you can add some sort of, in the original there's a few more scratches inside this little bit of face, so depending on the kind of level of finish that you're after, you can rework things. I'll also talk about a kind of final oil in to check your values, that sort of thing. But that's it for today. Hopefully that was interesting. I look forward to my next lesson. See ya.